Foggy Bottom Line Media. Hey everybody, Stan Scott here with Foggy Bottom Line Media, and welcome to the first episode of What the Right Looks Like. In this series, I'm going to describe the right-wing reactionary movement in the U.S. I'll be using some videos and some documents. A lot of this will come from my previous academic research on the right wing as a social movement. And I want folks to see what some of this right-wing work looks like. Everything from Project 2025 to some of the right-wing media stars like Tucker Carlson and Nick Fuentes, and some of the more marginal right-wingers like Aaron McIntyre, who I was talking about a little bit before here. And I wanted to kick this off by basically reading something. I talked about fascism in another podcast with respect to the way Umberto Eco and Hannah Arendt define fascism. But I wanted to bring up this document that the United States Army produced in 1945 about fascism. And I'm going to read it and talk about it a little bit. So this one's a little bit more academic. Before I get started with that, though, I want to remind you to subscribe to the podcast on YouTube, like us and share us, follow us on Instagram and Facebook and all those places. And you can see here's a link to our linked tree, which will give you links to all of those social media platforms. The base website is www.foggybottomline.com. So in March 1945, the U.S. Army created this, what they called a fact sheet, an orientation fact sheet. Now, here's a screenshot of the front page of this thing. It's on the Internet Archive. You can find it, and I'll share a link to it on the discussion page, on the description page of the YouTube video. But back in the day, and the Army still does this, or at least they did while I was serving, the Army would have periodic discussion groups where we would talk about, in my day, it was typically we'd talk about things like the Geneva Convention. We would talk about the rules of war. We talked about equal opportunity, about treating each other the right way. We talked about military discipline and the difference between a commander in or an NCO in your chain of command and one that's not in your chain of command. And the Army did this in World War II as well. Now, in March of 1945, the war in Europe was pretty close to being over. The Russians had entered Germany. We had entered Germany. The war had about 2 months left to go. And so the war in Europe was almost done, but we still didn't know how long the war against Japan would go. Italy had already left the war. They'd already been defeated. So it's an interesting time to talk about fascism. And I can tell you that part of this might have been that the U.S. had its own fascist contingent before the war. Lindbergh was a key leader of this. And they even held rallies that looked a lot like Nazi rallies in Nuremberg. And you can see an image of that here, where with George Washington basically in the background. This had the same aesthetic as some of Hitler's Nuremberg rallies and other rallies that he had in Germany before the war started and after the war started. But the Army wanted the soldiers to understand what they had fought for and how to recognize it later. So I'm going to basically read this, and I'm going to talk about it a little bit as I go, kind of like if I were a professor, which I am, sort of. So this starts with basically a series of, it's basically some notes for this week's discussion that might set up a discussion. And then it's a couple of questions like about how it works, can we spot it? And then at the end, there's some supplementary material that mostly includes quotes from leaders like FDR. So I'm going to just go ahead and start reading this, and then I'll talk about it and see if I can't relate it a little bit to what's going on in the U.S. today. So fascism is not the easiest thing to identify or analyze, nor, once in power, is it easy to destroy. It's important for our future and that of the world, and that as many of us as possible understand the causes and practices of fascism in order to combat it. Points to stress are fascism is more apt to come to power in a time of economic crisis. That's what happened in 1930s Germany. Fascism inevitably leads to war. It can come to any country, and we can best fight it by making democracy work. You are away from home, and remember, the target audience here are soldiers who are either deployed to Europe or Japan or at military bases away from home getting prepared for deployment. You are away from home, separated from your families, no longer at a civilian job or school, and many of you are risking your very lives because of this thing called fascism. Our country was attacked by a fascist aggressor, Japan. The sons of heaven were promptly joined by their fascist partners, Germany and Italy. Fascism is a word that's been used a great deal in the last few years. We've come across it in our newspapers, our newsreels. It comes up in our bull sessions. We've heard about the cruelties of fascism, the terror, its conquest of country after country. We've heard of its concentration camps like Dachau in Germany and its torture chambers like Majdanek in Poland. We've heard of its planned mass murder of whole peoples, which scholars call genocide. Some of the things that have been done to people by fascists seem too horrible to believe, especially to Americans who believe in live and let live. Hard-boiled American correspondents, formerly skeptical, now believe because they have seen it. We Americans have been fighting fascists for more than 3 years. When Cecil Brown, one of the leading war correspondents, came back from the battlefronts, he went on a trip that took him to big cities and small towns all over America. He talked and listened to all kinds of people. He found that most Americans are vague about just what fascism really means. He found few Americans who are confident they would recognize a fascist if they saw one. Are we in uniform any more certain what fascism is, where it came from, what made it strong? Do we know how fascism leads men to do the things done to the people at Majdanek and Dachau? Do we know how it leads them to attack helpless nations? Are Majdaneks in war inevitable results of fascism? Do all fascists speak only German, Italian, or Japanese? Or do some of them speak our language? Will military victory in this war automatically kill fascism, or could fascism rise in the U.S. after it's been crushed abroad? What can we do to prevent it? Perhaps we ought to get to know the answers. If we don't understand fascism and recognize fascism when we see it, it could crop up again under another label and cause another war. Fascism is a way to run a country. Here's the definition for the Army. Fascism is the way to run a country. It's the way Italy was run. It's the way Germany and Japan are run. Fascism is the precise opposite of democracy. The people run democratic governments, but fascist governments run the people. Fascism is government by the few and for the few. The objective is seizure and control of the economic, political, social, and cultural life of the state. Why? The democratic way of life interferes with their methods and desires for conducting business, living with their fellow men, having the final say in matters concerning others as well as themselves. The basic principles of democracy stand in the way of their desires, hence, democracy has to go. Anyone who is not a member of their inner gang has to do what he's told. They permit no civil liberties, no equality before the law. They make their own rules and change them when they choose. If you don't like it, it's TS. In this document, it says Tango Sierra, but I read Army, so I know that means tough shit. If you don't like it, it's tough shit. They maintain themselves in power by use of force, combined with propaganda based on primitive ideas of blood and race, by skillful manipulation of fear and hate, and by false promise of security. The propaganda glorifies war and insists it's smart and realistic to be pitiless environment. And we can see this today, folks, when we hear Republicans and conservatives and right-wingers use propaganda about great replacement, about minorities taking over the country, about the white race being discriminated against, by making you fear people who aren't like you, whether they're Jewish or black or just come from another country, they're immigrants. This is why they talked about Haitians eating cats and dogs. which wasn't happening, but they used it to gin up this fear and hate. So this was the initial part of this, the starting notes that would jumpstart a discussion. And I can tell you, when I held discussions like this with my soldiers, we would ask questions and get them to try to answer, right? And this is kind of the tactic this thing takes. I'm assuming that when they actually held these discussions, the soldiers that were listening and in the group could also ask questions and give their own thoughts on what was going on. So the first section is how it starts. Question: how does fascism get in power? How can a violent program that enslaves the people win any support? How can they win this electorally? I mean, Hitler was more or less elected to the German Reichstag. He ended up taking it over in a manipulative way, but he was elected to public office in a democratic election, probably the last one in the Weimar Republic. So here goes. Fascism came to power in Germany, Italy, and Japan at a time of social and economic unrest. The Great Depression was we were right in the middle of the Great Depression in the 30s. A small group of men, supported by powerful financial and military interests, convinced enough insecure people that fascism would give them the things they wanted. They did so partly by clever propaganda and deception. They promised the people that fascism would bring them great power and prosperity. The details differed from country to country, but the general pattern was the same. The Japanese spoke of a greater Asia co-prosperity sphere. Mussolini talked about humanitarian ideas and promised a reborn Roman Empire. Hitler and his associates adopted the name of the National Socialist German Workers' Party and announced objectives that attracted many German people. The official title of the party was deliberately worded for its propaganda value. The official nationalists, socialists, workers, and all the others who might be favorably influenced by these labels. At the very time the fascists proclaimed their party was the party of the average citizen, they were in the pay of big industrialists and financiers who wanted to run people with an iron hand. And can you see some parallels here with the Republicans today saying, crime is out of control. You need to be afraid. We can make you prosperous. These tariffs are going to fix the economy. We're going to drop the price of eggs. We're going to make you prosperous, make sure you can afford rent and all of that. And at the same time, they're taking money from the billionaires. I mean, the wealthy people, the corporations are funding these messages and these campaigns. So there's a lot of parallels here with the Trump administration and the Republicans and how they have run their electoral campaigns over the last several years. The fascists promised everything to everyone. They would make the poor rich and the rich richer. To the farmers, the fascists promised land through elimination of large estates. To the workers, they promised elimination of unemployment, jobs for all for high wages. To the small businessman, they promised more customers and profits through the elimination of large business enterprises. Well, Trump hasn't done that. To big businessmen and industrialists, they secretly promised greater security and profits through the elimination of small business competitors and trade unions and the crushing of socialists and communists. To the whole nation, they promised glory and wealth by conquest. They asserted it was their right as a superior people to rule the world. And you can see some notes like that today. As soon as these methods had won them enough of a following to form their stormtroops, the fascists began to use force to stifle and wipe out any opposition. Those who saw through the false front of fascism and opposed them were beaten, tortured, and killed. The fascists knew that all believers in the democracy were their enemies. They knew that the fundamental principle of democracy, faith in the common sense of the common people, was the direct opposite of the fascist principle of rule by the elite few. So they fought democracy in all its phases. At the same time that they proclaimed the superiority of the Germans, the Italians, the Japanese, they proclaimed also that the German, the Italian, and the Japanese people were really unfit to rule themselves. It became Heil Hitler in Germany and Believe, Obey, Fight in Italy. They played political, religious, social, and economic groups against each other and seized power while these groups struggled against each other. And you can see this now in Minneapolis, where they formed what amounts to a group of stormtroopers that are basically terrorizing neighborhoods, and they're using it to try to intimidate people. They've basically said, we know better, Trump, I alone can fix it, right? We know better, just let us have it. He wants to nationalize elections. He thinks elections are bad because the people shouldn't have a voice because he knows better. So that's the Army's sort of discussion of how can it start. And it starts with basically we'll promise everything to everybody, and once we're in office, we'll take power so we can keep it, so we can stay in office, right? So how does it work? How could the fascists keep their contradictory promises once they're in power? How did their program actually work out? Remember, this says that they promised the regular people jobs at high wages. They promised and they promised the small businessman, we'll tear down these big enterprises and divide them up, the estates for you. But at the same time, they're secretly telling the corporations, don't worry, we got your back. Well, they can't do both, right? It's easy enough for the fascists to promise all things to all people before they were in power. Once they were actually in power, of course, they could not keep their contradictory promises. They had intended to advance to break some, and they did break those that they had made to the middle classes, the workers, and the farmers. So they intentionally made promises they knew they weren't going to keep to middle class, workers, and farmers. As soon as the fascists were in control of the government, the torturings and the killings were no longer the unlawful acts of a political party and its hoodlum gangs. They became official government policy, like what you're seeing in ICE. Among the first victims of this policy were those farmers, workers, and small businessmen who had believed the promises that had been made to them and who complained that they had been sucked in. Some simply vanished. Often they came home to their families by return mail in little jars of ashes. We don't see that yet. The concentration camps and graves filled with opponents of fascism. Out went equality before the law, free elections, and free political parties. Independent trade unions and independent schools, they're attacking universities. Freedom of speech and freedom of the press, they're arresting journalists. And in time, freedom of religion. Pastor Niemöller was thrown into a concentration camp in Germany. Cardinal Innitzer was stoned and Catholic priests were imprisoned. Jews were murdered in cold blood and synagogues destroyed. Christian ministers were ousted from Japan. The fascists solved unemployment by converting their nations into giant war machines. The unemployed were either conscripted into the army or organized into labor battalions and put to work in war plants. Deprived of their unions, the working people could be driven to work longer and harder for less and less money, so that those who subsidized and ran fascism could grow richer. See any of that today in the U.S.? By wiping out all internal competition, especially the small and medium-sized business firms, profits were increased still higher for the handful on top. In some cases, the fascists then gobbled up control of the top corporations. The living standards of the masses, of the people, declined, of course. As they earned less and less, they were able to buy less and less of the goods they were producing. Every last detail of life was regulated, with the death penalty often imposed for slight violations. One unhappy victim complained, fascism is a regime under which everything not prohibited is compulsory, quote unquote. Once the fascists were in control of the government, not even the gang on top was safe from its own members. There would be a lot more loot and power per fascist leader if some fascist leaders were eliminated. Some of the party big shots and some of those who had helped them take over were therefore purged. Many would be partners in the dictatorship, including some industrialists wound up in jail, in exile, or dead. So that's talking about how it works once it's in power. They basically use intimidation and the police to oppress those who object when they don't keep their promises. And if they have enough support from the military and from the corporations, this is an effective strategy. So the next session asks, does fascism equal war? Okay, if we leave fascist nations alone, will they leave us alone? Or does fascism inevitably lead to war? We've seen that the people of a fascist state earn less and less, and so are able to buy less and less of the goods they produce with their slave labor. This means that eventually fascist leaders have to either abandon the system or look abroad for new markets to dispose of the mounting surplus of goods that cannot be sold at home. The fascists do not choose to abandon their system and give up their graft, so they're forced to acquire foreign markets and to eliminate competing nations. Due to their slave labor, the fascists are able to undersell the free nations of the world. The free nations must either resort to fascism so that with slave labor they can meet the cutthroat prices of the fascist nations, or they must erect trade barriers to keep out the ruthless fascist competition. Now, a lot of folks would say we see that today in the sense that we get a lot of our goods from basically slave labor in China and other Southeast Asian countries. So that's an interesting aspect of this. In either case, the fascist nation still wants the markets, and it goes after them with the same methods used in domestic affairs: intimidation, terror, and force. In foreign affairs, force means war. The war machine is ready and waiting for duty. To justify the building of the war machine as a solution to unemployment, the fascists nurture a lust for war, a desire for conquest. Live dangerously, said Mussolini. Man must become great through perpetual strife. This is a core tenet of fascism, screamed Hitler. A Nazi slogan was guns instead of butter. The hungry people were told they would get butter and other riches in due time by way of conquest. And this, you see shades of this in the Trump administration saying, we're going to see some hard economic times, but in the long run, things will be better for you, the regular people. Not sure I believe that. The press, radio, movie, stage, all were put to the task of glorifying war. The school system, from kindergarten to university, justified and exalted tyranny of the strong over the weak. The school is a preparation for the army, said the Nazi minister of education. Now they're at the very beginning of going after public education in this country, but they are already using it to indoctrinate people in the sense that they want to leave out key pieces of American history like slavery and Jim Crow and the Black Codes, civil rights stuff, the critical race theory, all that kind of thing. But they also glorify this perpetual strife idea in the sense they argue if you're poor, you're just not working hard enough. You got to compete harder. Right? If you're poor, you're just not working hard enough. Life is a competition with everyone else for resources, and if you're poor, it's your own fault, no matter why you're poor, right? The people were taught that their race was superior. Since this concept of superior and inferior race is completely contrary to the findings of all science, science has to be as carefully controlled and perverted as the schools. No scientist in Germany could safely deny it when Hitler told the Germans they were the master race, entitled to the land and possessions of lesser folk. The Italians were told in fake scientific terms that Latins were born to rule. The Japanese were taught as the sons of heaven it was both their right and their duty to conquer and rule the world. Once their people were sold on the master race idea, it was easy for the fascists to make them feel that other people were of no more consequence than vermin. We think nothing of killing a cockroach. They were encouraged to think nothing of killing unarmed and defenseless men, women, and children. Many even got to enjoy it. Hence, Rotterdam, Lidice, Majdanek, Dachau, Treblinsk. By all of these devices, fascism creates and then is driven by forces that cannot be stopped at will. Fascism cannot stand still. Its internal and external policies are rooted in aggression. It must expand and explode. It must conquer or perish. Every measure taken by fascism, its entire social, economic, political, and military setup means eventual war. The war comes when intimidation and terror fail as instruments of fascist foreign policy. The war comes when other nations finally refuse further to appease the insatiable hunger of fascism for markets, military glory, and world domination. Venezuela, Greenland, Iran. Next section is, can it happen here? And so this is the U.S. Army in 1945 discussing with American soldiers, some of them in the field, whether fascism could come to the U.S. Some Americans would give an emphatic no to the question, can fascism come to America after it's been defeated abroad? They would say that Americans are too smart, too sold on democracy as a way of life, that they wouldn't permit any group to put fascism over in America. Fascism, some might say, is something peculiar that you find only among people who like swastikas, who like to listen to speeches from balconies in Rome, or who think that their emperor is God. Do some folks think Trump is God? I've seen a lot of photos of him with pastors praying over him. It looks like they're worshiping him. The reaction might be that it is something foreign that Americans would recognize in a minute, like the goose step. They might feel that we'd laugh it out of existence in a hurry. But do all fascists come from Germany, Japan, and Italy? In good many European nations, the people felt the same way some of us do, that fascism was foreign to them and could never become a power in their land. They found, however, that fascist-minded people within their borders, especially with aid from the outside, could seize power. The Germans, of course, made efficient use of fascist-minded traitors that we have come to know generally as the fifth column. In France, which was considered a leading democracy of Europe, the betrayal was spearheaded by a powerful clique of 100% French fascists. Norway had its Quisling, who was as pure-blooded a Norwegian as Laval was a pure-blooded Frenchman. The Netherlands' Musserts were 100% Dutch. Belgium's de Grelle, 100% Belgian. And Britain's Mosley, 100% British. The United States also has its native fascists who say they are 100% American. They were native fascists in the Philippines, in Thailand, in China, in Burma, and many other countries, all waiting to become the willing puppets of the Axis. Not one of these fascists is a foreigner who had to be imported from Germany, Japan, or Italy. Have any Americans used fascist tactics and appeals? Most of the people in America like to be good neighbors, but at various times and places in our history, we have had some sorry instances of mob sadism, lynchings, vigilantism, terror, and suppression of civil liberties. We have had our hooded gangs, black legions, silver shirts, and racial and religious bigots. All of them, in the name of Americanism, have used undemocratic methods and doctrines which experience has shown to be properly identified as fascist. They're talking about the KKK here. They don't say it out loud because I suspect a lot of the people they're talking to were members. But this is who they're talking about, is the people who passed the black codes, passed the Jim Crow laws. The Mississippi in 1958, when I was born, was a fascist state. It just was a fascist state. Can we afford to brush them off as mere crackpots? We once laughed Hitler off as a harmless little clown and a funny mustache. In January 1944, 30 Americans, many of them native-born, were indicted by a federal grand jury on charges of conspiring with the Nazi Party to accomplish the objectives of said Nazi Party in the United States. These objectives, according to the indictment, included undermining and impairing the loyalty and morale of the military and naval forces of the United States. The case ended in a mistrial caused by the death of the presiding judge. The question of re-indictment is still under consideration. So we had homegrown fascists in the U.S. in 1944 who supported Hitler and wanted the Germans to still win. These people still exist in the U.S. today. Whenever free governments anywhere fail to solve their basic economic and social problems, there is always the danger that a native brand of fascism will arise to exploit the situation and the people, and we have to be careful about that today. So how can we spot it? Asked the Army. How can we identify Native American fascists at work? So as I read this, I want you to think about what's going on in the U.S. today and if you see any parallels to what they warned against in 1945. An American fascist seeking power would not proclaim that he is a fascist. Fascism always camouflages its plans and purposes. Hitler made demagogic appeals to all groups and swore, "Neither I nor anyone in the National Socialist Party advocates proceeding by anything but constitutional methods. Any fascist attempt to gain power in America would not use the exact Hitler pattern. It would work under the guise of super patriotism and super Americanism. Fascist leaders are neither stupid nor naive. They know that they must hand out a line that sells." Huey Long is said to have remarked that if fascism came to America, it would be on a program of Americanism. And I think it was another author who said that when fascism comes to America, it will come wrapped in the flag and carrying the cross, which is a much closer parallel to what we're seeing today with the white Christian nationalism. Fascists in America may differ slightly from fascists in other countries, but there are a number of attitudes and practices that they have in common. following are three. Every person who has one of them is not necessarily a fascist, but he is in a mental state that lends himself to the acceptance of fascist aims. 1. The pitting of religious, racial, and economic groups against one another in order to break down national unity as a device of the divide and conquer technique used by Hitler to gain power in Germany and in other countries. With slight variations to suit local conditions, fascists everywhere have used the Hitler method. In many countries, anti-Semitism, hatred of Jews, is a dominant device of fascism. In the U.S., native fascists have often been anti-Catholic, anti-Jew, anti-Negro, anti-labor, anti-foreign born. See that? In South America, the native fascists use the same scapegoats, except they substitute anti-Protestantism for anti-Catholicism. Interwoven with the master race theory of fascism is a well-planned hate campaign against minority races, religions, and other groups. To suit their particular needs and aims, fascists will use any one or a combination of such groups as a convenient scapegoat. So here in the U.S., scapegoating immigrants, scapegoating blacks, especially with respect to crime, right? Scapegoating communists and socialists, scapegoating minorities of any kind, scapegoating Muslims for the religious aspect of it. So, I mean, there's bad people in all of these groups, but not all of them are routinely bad or categorically bad, right? But these folks scapegoat them, they fearmonger. The Haitians are going to eat your cat, which not only makes you afraid for your pet, but it's disgusting to think about, right? If they're really doing that, they must be an inferior group of people, right? Not to mention just mean and disgusting, right? So you can see this happening today in the U.S., right? Fascism cannot tolerate, number two, fascism cannot tolerate such religious and ethical concepts as the brotherhood of man. Fascists deny the need for international cooperation. Sound like Trump? These ideas contradict the fascist theory of the master race. The brotherhood of man implies that all people, regardless of color, race, creed, or nationality, have rights. International cooperation, as expressed in the Dumbarton Oaks proposals, run counter to the fascist program of war and domination. We don't have to cooperate because we're better than everyone else. In place of international cooperation, the fascists seek to substitute a perverted sort of ultranationalism, which tells their people that they are the only people in the world who count. With this goes hatred and suspicion toward the people of other nations. Right now, our native fascists are spreading anti-British, anti-Soviet, anti-French, anti-UN propaganda. They know that Allied unity now foretells the certain defeat of fascism abroad. They know that post-war Allied unity means world peace and security. They realize that fascism cannot thrive or grow under these conditions. So it's not just demonizing people inside your own country. You have to demonize those in other countries and say, we don't need to cooperate with NATO. NATO is they just suck up our resources. They're not doing anything for us. They need us more than we need them, right? So you can see some shades of that here. Number three, it is accurate to call a member of the Communist Party a communist. For short, he is often called a red. Indiscriminate pinning of the label red on people and proposals which one opposes is a common political device. It's a favorite trick of native as well as foreign fascists. Many fascists make the spurious claim that the world has but two choices, either fascism or communism, and they label as communist everyone who refuses to support them. By attacking our free enterprise capitalist democracy and by denying the effectiveness of our way of life, they hope to trap many people. Hitler insisted that only fascism could save Europe and the world from the communist menace. There were many people inside and outside of Germany and Italy who welcomed and supported Hitler and Mussolini because they believed fascism was the only safeguard against communism. The red bogey was a convincing enough argument to help Hitler take and maintain power. The Rome, Berlin, Tokyo axis, whose aggressions plunged the world into global war, was also called the anti-Comintern axis. As it was proclaimed by Hitler, Mussolini, and Hirohito as a bulwark against capitalism. Learning to identify native fascists and to detect their techniques is not easy. They plan it that way, but it's vitally important to learn to spot them, even though they adopt names and slogans with popular appeal, drape themselves in the U.S. flag, and attempt to carry out their program in the name of democracy they are trying to destroy. And you can see the communist thing. One of the big things now is anyone really to the left of Dick Cheney is called a socialist now. The communist word has faded a little bit. Now they're just socialist. You know, the Marxist agenda, the socialist agenda, the LGBTQ agenda. It's all about demonizing people and placing them in this box that is framed as they're automatically evil because they believe these other things, whether they believe them or not. No mainline Democrat is a socialist. They're just not. Most mainline Democrats do not propose socializing the means of production. They don't want to nationalize oil companies. They're just not socialists. So the Army goes on. How to stop it. How can we prevent fascism from developing in the U.S.? The only way to prevent fascism from getting a hold in America is by making our democracy work and by actively cooperating to preserve world peace and security. Lots of things can happen inside of people when they are unemployed or hungry. They become frightened, angry, desperate, confused. Many, in their misery, seek to find someone to blame. They look for a scapegoat as a way out. Fascism is always ready to provide one. In its bid for power, it is ready to drive wedges that will disunite the people and weaken the nation. It supplies the scapegoat: Catholics, Jews, Negroes, labor unions, big business. Any group upon which the insecure and unemployed can be brought to pin the blame for their misfortune. You didn't get that job because of DEI. That black woman got the job. The black man got the job. The woman got the job. The Jew got the job. DEI. You should have gotten that university slot. You should have gotten that scholarship, but you didn't because you're white. Black got it. Black guy got it. That's how they drive this wedge. We all know that many serious problems will face us when the war is over. If there's a period of economic stress, it will create tensions among our people, including us as returning veterans. The resentment may be directed against minorities, especially if undemocratic organizations with power and money can direct our emotions and thinking along these lines. The fascist doctrine of hate fulfills a triple mission. By creating disunity, it weakens democracy. By getting men to hate rather than think, it prevents men from seeking the real cause and a democratic solution to the problem. By fake promises of job and security, fascism then tries to lure men to its program as a way out of insecurity. Only by democratically solving the economic problems of our day can there be any certainty that fascism won't happen here. That is our job as citizens. So we have to think this stuff true. Ask ourselves, should we be afraid of the immigrant? Do we need to deport them all? Folks, this ICE stuff, it's ethnic cleansing in the U.S. They're honestly attempting to deport everyone who wasn't born a U.S. citizen of two U.S. parents. That's their goal, and they've said that out loud. Citizenship in a democracy is more than a ballot dropped in a box on election day. It's a 365 days a year job requiring the active participation and best judgment of every citizen in the affairs of his community, his nation, and his country's relations with the world. Fascism thrives on indifference and ignorance. It makes headway when people are apathetic or cynical about their government, when they think of it as something far removed from them and beyond their personal concern. The erection of a traffic light on your block is important to your safety and the safety of your children. The erection of a world organization to safeguard peace and world security is just as important to our personal security. Both must be the concern of every citizen. Freedom, like peace and security, cannot be maintained in isolation. It involves being alert and on guard against the infringement not only of our own freedom, but the freedom of every American. If we permit discrimination, prejudice, or hate to rob any one of his democratic rights, our own freedom and all democracy is threatened. Folks, ICE is pulling American citizens, usually women, out of their cars because they don't like being observed. They'll come for someone else next. They won't limit it to liberals in blue cities. When the time comes and they need to, they'll come after you and me. What is true of America is true of the world. The germ of fascism cannot be quarantined in a Munich brown house or balcony in Rome. If we want to make sure that fascism does not come to America, we must make certain that it does not thrive anywhere in the world. So the call out here is, when you get home, democracy is the way. And it's interesting that the folks who returned from duty in World War II basically led the civil rights movement, because it was black soldiers coming back who finally were able to stand up and say, now I have the moral argument against the bigotry and discrimination and racism. I fought for this country too. Lost my buddies, lost my brother. I fought for it too, and I deserve the same rights you have. And that's ultimately what broke the Jim Crow policies in the South and in the North. So that concludes the main set. There's some listed aids for discussion leaders here, and this is basically a series of questions. It says a short 5 to 10 minute introductory talk is by the discussion leaders recommended. Suggested points: we're at war because of fascism. Americans are vague about the meaning of fascism. Many doubt the horrible things about places. We hear about places like Dachau and Majdanek. What is fascism? Fascism is a dictatorship. We talked about that. Authoritarian government by the few. Fascists stay in power by force, right? So, and then there's some supplementary material. I won't read all of this because it's largely quotes from leaders. The first section is, are the stories of German fascist cruelties true? Genocide, death camps, yes. Basically wipe out or cripple for generations entire racial groups and nations. Talks about Majdanek, which was a concentration camp in Poland. A veritable river rouge of the production of death. It was estimated Soviet and Polish authorities, as many as 1.5 million persons from nearly every country in Europe were killed in the last 3 years. And folks, the Trump administration's already started this. They tell you they're focusing it on immigrants, sending them to CICOT, to this, what amounts to a concentration camp overseas in El Salvador. But they've also sent at least one American citizen there and resisted a judge's order to bring them back. So it's not out of the realm of possibility that could move forward for American citizens as well. Are democracy and fascism diametrically opposed? The proposed new order is the very opposite of a United States of Europe or a United States of Asia. It's not a government based on the consent of the governed. It's not a union of ordinary, self-respecting men and women. It's an unholy alliance of power and self to dominate and enslave the human race. That's President Roosevelt on 29 December 1940, describing fascism in Germany and Italy and Japan. Here's an Adolf Hitler quote: "To sum up, I see two diametrically opposed principles. The principle of democracy, which, wherever it is allowed to practical effect, is the principle of destruction, and the principle of authority, of personality, which I would call the principle of achievement." And you see in the U.S. today, this authority of personality, Donald Trump, everything he says, I'm the only one who can help it, fix it. I know everything. The hat, Donald Trump got everything right. And you see this in some of the talks that are given by right-wing reactionaries. Curtis Yarvin's a big one here, who thinks we need a monarchy again, and others. And this series will talk about some of those folks and what they're saying. So I'll build upon this as we go forward. The Army asks, is it true that powerful financial and military interests supported the German and Italian fascists? Fritz Thyssen, the wealthiest of the German industrialists, admitted giving the Nazis funds as early as 1928. In his book, I Paid Hitler, written after leaving Germany, he wrote, "It was during the last years preceding the Nazi seizure of power that the big industrial corporations began to make contributions. All in all, the amounts given by heavy industry to the Nazis may be estimated at 2 million marks a year, a lot more money now than today's money. It must be understood, however, that this includes only the voluntary gifts. So not only do Elon Musk donated to Trump's campaign, right? Billionaires and corporations are giving to the Republican Party because they want the kind of government Trump is trying to create, which is, if not a fascist, then it's a quasi-fascist state like you see in Hungary with Viktor Orban, right? Of Italy, Summer Wells, former Undersecretary of State, writes that especially the reactionary elements and the larger banking and industrial interests welcomed the dictatorship of Mussolini. So they may regret it later when the government starts to shake them down, like Trump is already doing to Microsoft, for example. But at first, they're like, yeah, this guy's going to work for us. They're going to cut our taxes. They're going to give us everything we want, right? They're going to make it possible for us to pay very low wages. They're not going to raise minimum wages, that kind of thing. So they're happy to see him take power. Must fascism expand or explode? Fascism believes neither in the possibility nor in the utility of perpetual peace. War alone brings up to their highest tension all human energies and puts the stamp of nobility upon the peoples who have the courage to meet it. For fascism, the tendency to empire, that is to say, the expansion of empire, is a manifestation of vitality. Its opposite, staying at home, a sign of decadence. So this is the idea I talked about in the Umberto Eco show, where I talked about how perpetual strife and competition is a hallmark of fascism. This we haven't really seen here in the U.S., but I'd say the Greenland thing is the first hint of this. Look, we need Greenland. We should have Greenland. It should be ours. Denmark's not doing anything with it. We need to protect it from the Chinese and the Russians, right? So it's ours. This is a kind of imperialism that, and honestly, the United States has always seen that thread, especially in Latin and South America, but also in Southeast Asia. So we need to be on the lookout for that here as well. What is a scapegoat? An animal or person whose sins, evils, ill luck, etc., is ceremonially attached, the victim then being sacrificed or driven out as symbolic of dispelling the evils. So we got to get rid of these Haitians because they're evil. They eat cats, right? A person or thing blamed for others. So it's not my fault I didn't get that job. It's DEI, right? It's the liberals they want to promote these incompetent minorities over me because I'm white. They're intentionally trying to take white power away from white people. That's a scapegoat. What's the difference between communism and fascism? Are they essentially the same? In any discussion on fascism, there will be those who argue that there are strong similarities between fascism and communism. And if you think about Soviet communism, that's a true statement. There's a lot going on there. Under both systems, there's neither freedom of speech or press as we know it. Both forms of government permit only one political party. Both have a secret police. But beyond this, there are important and fundamental differences in philosophy, aims, purposes, and methods. In their systematic destruction of all opposing groups, Hitler and Mussolini had the communists first on their list. Among the early opponents of fascism, the communists were in the forefront. Let's take three fundamental concepts: war and peace, race, and the purpose of the state, and see how the two systems stack up. Since the Soviet Union is associated in most minds with communism and the only working example, reference is frequently made to Soviet practice in the comparison with characteristic fascist practice. And I'll tell you right up front before I get into this that these guys quote the Soviet Constitution as if it were enforced the same as the U.S. Constitution was at the time. Note that we were their allies. The Soviet Union was still relatively new, and we hadn't really seen the kind of systematic oppression that the Communist Party in the Soviet Union and in the Eastern Bloc states exercised after World War II and during the Cold War. So you got to take this with a grain of salt. But the underlying concepts, right, are are not completely invalid. So war and peace. We've seen how by its economic and political structure that fascism means war. Fascism, Germany, Japan, or Italy, has never been secretive about its glorification of war and its aim of world conquest. With the conquest of Ethiopia, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Manchuria, Poland, Norway, Denmark, Greece, the Netherlands, Belgium, France, Bulgaria, Romania, Yugoslavia, fascism came close to achieving its goal. There was one time when fascism meant to make good on its promise. While the early leaders of communism in the Soviet Union advocated world revolution, Stalin modified this policy in 1927. Well, he said he did. He exiled Trotsky and others who opposed his position that the greatest Soviet contribution to world socialism would be a demonstration to the world that socialism could work in one country. Not an invalid goal, not the way it went. On the record, the avowed Soviet policy has been peace through international collective security, if possible, or strong defenses by its own efforts if collective security failed. Originally excluded from the League of Nations, the Soviet Union joined in 1934. During the next 5 years, it took a strong stand for collective action against aggression. After the Munich sellout in September 1938, pursuing its realistic policies, the Soviet looked at it to its own protection. The Soviet made a non-aggression pact with Germany in 1939, which the Nazis broke, and a 5-year non-aggression pact with Japan in 1941. Through pledges at the conferences in Moscow, Tehran, and Yalta, and through daily repetitions to its people, the Soviet has affirmed its aim as lasting peace through international cooperation. None of this really played out, folks. It just didn't. The Communist Party of the Soviet Union looked a lot more like a fascist government than anything else, except that the fascists in Germany and Italy and Japan did not basically take government control of the means of production. Now, that's a fine line, because what does government control mean? Does it mean you have a bureaucrat running as a CEO, a government worker as a CEO, or a military person as a CEO? Or does it mean, could it simply mean that you're going to do what we tell you to do? So arguably, German and Italian fascism looked a lot like Soviet communism. Soviet communism looked an awful lot like German and Soviet fascism. And it honestly looked more like fascism than it looked like what true communism really would look like, if that were ever possible, right? Donald Nelson, former chairman of the War Production Board, stated, "I know from what I saw and heard in Russia that the leaders and the people of that great country are anxious to work with us. They know that only world cooperation and enduring peace can produce the rapid internal development of Russia, which is their main concern." And that, again, they're talking to people who are fighting alongside the Russians, and they sort of needed to downplay the inherent conflicts between democracy and capitalism. Okay. On race, fascism and communism on race. The peoples of fascist nations are led to believe that they are the master race, or Herrenvolk, superior to all of the peoples, and that's their divine mission to dominate the earth. Fascism created and exploited racial hates to acquire a following, to disunite nations, and to enslave the peoples of Europe and Asia. The only differences which exist are those between the Nordic humans on one side and the animals, including the non-Nordic humans and the inferior humans on the other side. This is a quote from Dr. H. Gauch, leading German racial theorist and the new basis of the racial scientists, 1935. In old Russia, under the Tsars, most of the 189 national minorities who lived there were persecuted and oppressed. National languages were forbidden, and education was suppressed. It's generally conceded today in the Soviet Union there is no such thing as racial discrimination in theory or in practice. No, they oppressed everyone equally. So that doesn't really follow, because, and folks, the honest truth is, the only example for communism we have is Soviet communism, and this is written at a time when they were trying to downplay the similarities rather than expose them. The communism and fascism on the purpose of the state, and this is where it gets a little bit more real. The political fascist state is based on the leader principle under which the people must follow blindly the dictates of a few men. In the Axis countries, the emergence of fascism meant a taking away of self-government As fascism grows more powerful, it permits its people less and less liberty and uses more and more violence. The Soviets early believed that a dictatorship of the proletariat was necessary in order to destroy capitalism and set up socialism, that then the dictatorship would gradually evolve into a democracy as now provided in their constitution. Thus, although they now have a secret police and a government-controlled press, their ultimate political ideals are directly opposite to the stated goals of fascist dictatorship, right? In fascism treats women as mere breeders. Children, kitchen, and church was the Nazi slogan for women, and we see shades of that today. So at the end of the day, the fascism, as outlined in this document, as part of a discussion with American soldiers and other allies in the field, was about making sure that these people could recognize it by pointing out that fascism could come and in some ways had already come to the U.S., okay? And that we need to be on the lookout for it. And the way to fight it is to promote democracy, to pay attention as citizens, to participate. And so that's what I would ask you all to do. Now, I'll build on this as I go forward with this show. I'll show you videos of people like Curtis Yarvin and Aaron McIntyre and Nick Fuentes. I'll talk a little bit about the schisms on the right, because I want folks to see what the right looks like. A core piece of our mission here at Foggy Bottom Line Media is to counter disinformation and misinformation and do the best we can to expose this kind of ideology, these ways of thinking. The idea that we should be afraid of someone because they come from Mexico, that we should be afraid of Haitians, that we should be afraid of someone because they believe in a different religion than we do, right? That we should be afraid of Sharia law, but to fight that, we have to impose a Christian version of Sharia law. So these are important things to think about. Fascism is coming to America. There's no doubt in my military mind that the MAGA project is a fascist project. It has all the hallmarks. You can see many of them in this document, the foreshadowed in this document. You can see many of them in Umberto Eco's 14 Points, and in Hannah Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism book. So more to come on this, but I wanted to get this out there. And I'll post the link to the original document in case some of you would rather read it than listen to me speak it. But I thought it was important to get this out there and on YouTube and on the social media so that you could see where we're coming from here. So that's all for today. I appreciate you watching. Please don't forget to subscribe, share, comment, hit the little bell so you'll get notifications. Take a look at our TikTok and our other social media, because we have some shorter stuff there and on Facebook Reels. So just keep an eye out, look for us, share, comment, let us know what you think. We do want feedback on what we're doing, what we can do better, what we need to talk about, where you think we're wrong or right. Folks, this is Stan Scott, Foggy Bottom Line Media. First episode of What the Right Looks Like, and this is it. Thanks, folks, and I'm out here.